Welcome to Based on a True Story, the podcast that compares your favorite Hollywood movies with history. Today is December 7th, 2024.
A date which will live in infamy.
Does that sound familiar? That is a recording of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt addressing Congress on December 8th, 1941, about an event that happened exactly 83 years ago today, the day before Roosevelt's speech, on December 7th, 1941. The surprise attack at Pearl Harbor is an event that's been covered in numerous movies over the years, but perhaps none have had such an impact on what we believe about the true story today as that epic war film from 1970 called Tora, Tora, Tora. Even though it's a classic I'm sure we've all seen, it did come out 54 years ago. So just in case it's been a little while since you've seen the movie, let's do a quick synopsis to refresh our memory. The movie's version of the story begins in the year 1939 with the Japanese leaders who are trying to figure out how to neutralize the U.S. Pacific Fleet as a means to help secure the raw materials that they need for Japan's war in China and expansion in the Pacific. A secretive plan is conceived to launch a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. Admiral Yamamoto emphasizes the importance of catching the Americans off guard to ensure Japan's success in the Pacific. In the movie, the diplomatic tensions between the U.S. and Japan escalate as negotiations falter, and we see a lot of American intelligence as it's intercepting Japanese communications and trying to figure out what the heightened Japanese military activity means. Back in Washington, D.C., Colonel Rufus Bratton and Lieutenant Commander Alvin Kramer grow increasingly alarmed by the intercepted messages, but struggle to convince their superiors of the immediacy of the threat. All the intelligence suggests an attack is coming, but when and where? As the Japanese fleet prepares for the attack, scenes shift in the movie between the meticulous planning on their carriers and the increasing complacency among American commanders at Pearl Harbor. The narrative intensifies as critical warning signs seem to pop up and are ignored. In Pearl Harbor, we see radar operators detect an incoming wave of aircraft, but dismiss it as a squadron of American bombers expected from the mainland. The USS Ward reports sinking a Japanese submarine near the harbor's entrance, but that report seems to get lost in the communication breakdowns and delays in relaying intelligence that all seems to imply the U.S. simply does not expect an attack on American soil. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, we see the Japanese launch their attack in two waves. The first wave targets airfields and battleships moored at Pearl Harbor. Japanese planes inflict catastrophic damage in the movie, destroying many ships in the U.S. Pacific Fleet, and explosions rip through battleships like USS Arizona, while American forces scramble to mount a defense amid chaos. Then the second wave follows, further crippling the naval base and solidifying the devastation. And then at the end of the movie, we get Admiral Yamamoto's most famous quote from the film, fearing that the attack may have awakened a sleeping giant. To help us separate fact from fiction, today we'll be joined by none other than Jon Parshall. Now, if you're a history buff who loves World War II history, you already know who he is. And you might recall that Jon was already on the show a little while back to talk about the Battle of Midway, as it was covered in both the 1976 film, which we covered as his first time watching that one since the theaters, and the 2019 Midway movie, which he was a historical consultant for, and in support of his acclaimed book called Shattered Sword, about the Battle of Midway. Well, now Jon is working on a new book all about what happened right after Pearl Harbor over at 1942book.com. And he is still working on that book right now. So for today, let's start by setting up our two truths and a lie game. So here are three random facts that you'll learn about in the episode. Number one, the Japanese wanted to launch a third wave of planes, but couldn't after they lost the element of surprise. Number two, Ambassador Nomura didn't know the attack was coming. Number three, there is no evidence that Yamamoto actually said the famous sleeping giant quote. Got him? Okay, I forgot to tell you that one of those facts is not true at all. One of them is just an all-out lie. How good are you at fact-checking history? If you're not sure, don't worry, I've got the answer locked away in the envelope right here, and we'll find out which one is a lie at the end of the episode. And now, it's time to connect with Jon Parshall about the historical accuracy of Tora, Tora, Tora. I always like to kick off with a letter grade for historical accuracy because we all know movies are not entirely accurate. They're not documentaries. But Tora, Tora, Tora is a little bit different in how it presents itself. So I'm going to start by quoting the text at the beginning of the movie. It says, "The American Pacific Fleet was attacked and partially destroyed by Japan on Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941. This attack led to the entering of the United States into World War II. All of the events and characters depicted are true to historical fact. Now, that last line really stuck out to me because most movies that I've covered here, they claim to be based on a true story. But that one's saying all the events and characters are true to historical fact. And it seems, I mean, to me, it implies it's basically a documentary. So I'm going to start off with a two-part question rather than just asking the letter grade. One, are all the events and characters in Tora true to historical fact? And if not, I'm guessing maybe we'll continue with the episode. It's not an A++++ for letter grade for historical accuracy. So what would it get?
That's a great question. I think they get a very good grade overall. I do think that there are some characters in here that I have a suspicion are composite characters, right? And we see that on a fairly frequent basis in movies. But yeah, overall, I'd give it an A-.
Nice.
Really.
Okay.
Yeah, a very strong grade. I think that this movie stands up very well. Given even despite the fact that it's 40 some years, maybe almost 50 years old at this point. I can't believe I'm even saying that. So yeah, it gets a good grade. There are some things, obviously, just given the nature of the special effects that they can use during this time. I mean, we're using American aircraft carriers, post-war aircraft carriers, to film a lot of these sequences, and so those are not necessarily, they don't look like a Japanese aircraft carrier. Although the time that they do use models in the movie, those are of very high quality.
At the beginning of the movie, we find out the reason for the Japanese attacking Pearl Harbor, as well as the reason why it's such a surprise for the Americans. And from the Japanese perspective, the movie explains that they're faced with an embargo of the raw materials that they need for their war in China. According to the movie, they basically have two choices: improve diplomatic relations with the U.S. and withdraw from China, or find another source of raw materials in Indochina. And then a little later in the movie, we find out that the Japanese have set a deadline of October for the diplomatic solution of things. And then from the American perspective, the movie sets up that even though the fleet has moved from San Diego to Pearl Harbor, the movie says that there's not going to be an attack at Pearl Harbor because a torpedo dropped will plunge to 75 feet and Pearl Harbor is only 40 feet deep, so that's not going to happen. But how well does the movie do setting up these two different sides of the story prior to the attack?
That's all fairly well done, although I'd say that the American explanation of things is sort of overly simplistic. So let's talk about that. From the Japanese perspective, that's right on the money. They're involved in this war in China. The raw materials that are being cut off are American raw materials. We basically, as a result of their move south into French Indochina, which is now Vietnam, the Americans put in place an embargo on the Japanese that cut off all of their scrap iron and steel exports, but most importantly, oil. And Japan has no domestic source of oil. And so at this point, the clock is running. Unless that oil embargo ends, they're going to run out of oil within, a couple of years, something like that, which doesn't sound all that drastic. But if you've sunk as much blood and treasure into building up your Navy in the interwar years as the Japanese have, you're now in a position where you got to use it or lose it, right? Because without oil, that Navy is useless. And so the clock is ticking as far as the Japanese are concerned. And the only place that they can get oil, if they can't get it from us, they've got to go down south to Borneo and Indonesia, because that's where the oil is, in Java and Borneo and those places. So, yeah, that's what's happening on the Japanese side. They've either got to come to a diplomatic solution or they've got to wage war in the South Pacific. From the American side, yeah, we move our battle fleet, the Pacific portion of our fleet, and understand, of course, as being a two-ocean country, we've got our fleet is basically split in half, and the Atlantic units are all out there, and the Pacific units traditionally are based in San Diego. We make the decision to move them out to Pearl Harbor as a deterrent, to let the Japanese know we're serious about this. But the ability of the Japanese to attack our units at Pearl Harbor is still an ongoing source of controversy. The torpedo thing is one thing. Pearl Harbor is a relatively shallow harbor. typically torpedoes, when you dump them in the water back in the day from an airplane, would need, 75 to 100 feet. It would dive down before it would come back up to running depth again. So that's one thing. But more important, I think, we did not understand at this point in time the level of sophistication that the Japanese carrier forces evolved to. We thought in our minds that, okay, maybe they would conduct a raid against us, because we had done similar things during some of our exercises in the interwar years too. We had used our own carriers like Lexington to attack Pearl Harbor. In our mind, a raid would be maybe one Japanese carrier, maybe two, and they'd launch 30, 40, 50 aircraft, and then they'd turn around and run, right? What's happened is, starting in April 1941, the Japanese make this sort of conceptual leap to what would happen if we started using our carriers instead of in ones and twos. What if we took all the big flight decks in our Navy and put them together into one great big carrier fleet? And so in April of 41, they make the decision to do that. And it's one thing to issue an order and say, okay, we'll create this thing called, the mobile fleet. It's quite another to then work out all of the nuts and bolts of how do you actually make that happen? You got to figure out, how are these ships going to steam together? How, when they launch aircraft, how many are they going to put up at a time? Once those aircraft are up in the air, okay, now I've got these groups of aircraft from 4 of these carriers, later 6 of these carriers. How are they going to operate in the air? Are we going to put them into one big cohesive strike force? Are they still going to be commanded by the individual carrier captains? So there are all these nuts and bolts that have got to be worked out. And that's all happening during the summer of 1941 as the Japanese are thinking to themselves, we may go to war. And if we do, Admiral Yamamoto, who's the head of Combined Fleet, is like, we're going to attack Pearl Harbor. So you can think of this almost in terms of like a disease. It's like this is cancer metastasizing. And the Japanese carrier force is a completely different animal in 6 months from April to like November of 1941. They bring on 2 brand spanking new carriers, the Shokaku and the Zuikaku. So now they got 6 carriers to play with. They work through all these administrative issues, and they come to the conclusion that what we're going to do is we're going to put up these great big groups of aircraft, 160, 180, 190 planes at a time. They're going to be commanded by a single commander in the air. And now we've got the ability to not launch 30 planes, but, damn near 200, and come and, I can now release these enormous pulses of combat air power, which can do strategically meaningful things on the battlefield. This is absolutely revolutionary. And the British Navy and the American Navy have not made that same leap. It's kind of the same thing, if you look at 911. If you would talk to the average American on the street on September 12th, 2001, and said, could you weaponize commercial airliners and fly them into buildings in a coordinated fashion and turn them into terrorist weapons? Everybody would be like, well, yeah, that's obvious. But it sure as hell wasn't obvious 2 days before, right? And so the Japanese have made this leap and the other navies have not. And so that, I think, just from a conceptual standpoint, that is why the Americans feel that they're safe at Pearl Harbor, because the Japanese, we don't understand their abilities. First of all, with their carriers, and also the other thing I should mention is underway refueling. How do you actually get a force of carriers 3,500 miles across the Pacific? We didn't know that the Japanese had actually figured out how to use tankers to refuel those ships underway, and now they've got this capability where not only can they bring this great, big, powerful force, but they can refuel it and bring it off of Hawaii. So there's a bunch of things going on there on the American side as to why we don't have the sense of danger that we might well have had, a little later on the war when we understood what their carriers could actually do. Sorry, that's kind of a long-winded explanation, but there's nuance there.
And I like the example that you gave of, with 9/11 and how after something happens, then you know that can be done that way.
That's the thing.
And that leads right into something I want to ask about that the movie shows with the airfields on the island. It really suggests in the movie that the Americans are just not expecting an attack, because we see a scene where I think it was General Walter Short notices that the airplanes are spread out in standard procedure in case of an enemy air attack, But he's like, there's 130,000 Japanese on the island. Our biggest problem to worry about is sabotage. So the planes are then grouped together into airfields, and not to get too far ahead of the timeline, like I implied to earlier, the result is not good. Rows of airplanes just blowing up easily as they're attacked from the air. And that seems like one of those miscues that's it's an obvious blunder after the fact, after we knew about it. But did that really happen?
Oops. Yeah, no, it really did.
Okay.
There's a little nuance there. I know the guy who is the greatest Pearl Harbor scholar in the world, and he says that it kind of varied from airfield to airfield as just how densely those aircraft were grouped together. But yes, broadly speaking, General Short, who's the Army commander on Oahu, thinks that sabotage is the more serious threat. And so in order to make those planes more easily guardable, he congregates them into the middle of the airstrips so that he can put, sentries around them to make sure that nobody can sneak up and try to blow these things up. Because yes, we were very concerned. I forget what the percentage of the population on Oahu was first or second generation Japanese, but it's 30, 40, 50%, something like that. There's a lot of Japanese people there, but as it turns out, they were Americans, and there really was very, very little in the way of a fifth column or something like that.
One thing that we see throughout the movie is the American intelligence trying to figure out what the Japanese are up to. And there's a mention of even how the Americans can decode the messages faster than the Japanese embassy in Washington. So they seem to be, at least in the movie, it seems like they almost know what's going on in real time as things are being sent, or as close as you can get in real time in 1941, I guess. There's in the intelligence circle, there's mentions of things like the 12 apostles, the 12 people that are allowed to see the Japanese intercepts, President of the United States, for example. Although there was a time, I think, where the movie mentions there was like something found in the waste bin at the an intercept in the waste bin in the White House or something like that. And so he's taken off. He gets added up again. But overall, how well does the movie do showing the American code-breaking capabilities and the intelligence and their impact on the events leading up to December 7th?
Right. Good question. And I'm just going to put out right away that I do not consider myself a scholar of the cryptographic side of this battle. I'm good enough to be dangerous, but that's not really my thing. But I can certainly paint some broad brush pictures of what's going on here. It is true that we had broken two different sets of Japanese codes. The first one that you alluded to is the diplomatic codes that are going back and forth between their embassies and their foreign minister back in Tokyo, a guy named Togo. So we could break that stuff. We've also recently broken the Japanese naval operations code, which is called JN25. And we're reading some of that traffic as well at this time. The problem is that, on a good day, we can maybe decipher, 10, 20% of the code groups at any given message. The diplomatic stuff is better than that, but we're really gated in terms of translation manpower. This is right before the war. Our military, all through the Depression, has been starved of people and resources and money. And we're not on a war footing at this point. I was just reading a little bit more about this morning. I mean, the Army had maybe a half dozen good Japanese translators in its crypto unit. The Navy probably had a similar number. So you're talking about a dozen people trying to evaluate the intelligence that's coming through here. And of course, it's one thing to be able to decode the message. It's another to be then able to translate that into English and then analyze, okay, well, what the heck does this mean, right? So, yes, ex post facto, fast forward to 1945, 1946. By the end of the war, we have thousands of translators working this stuff. And it's being aided by IBM tabulation machines. We're using, machine-aided methods to do this stuff. So by the end of the war, we are reading Japanese diplomatic traffic that's going between their foreign ministry out to the embassy in Moscow, for instance. We're reading that and translating that and turning it into English faster than the Japanese are doing it themselves. It's really impressive. That is not where we are at in September and October of 1941. So at the end of the war, they went back. Now we've got all these analysts. Let's go back and actually look at some of these messages that were floating around in September and October and November. Let's decode those suckers now. What did they tell us? And, first of all, there's thousands of messages that you got to go through. Were there smoking guns in there? Yeah, there absolutely were. There was a message that was translated in 1946 that laid out the exact composition of Nagumo's carrier task force, down, ship by ship and yada, yada, yada. So, if they had gotten lucky and gotten the right messages and gotten them translated by one of those, 6 dudes, we might have gotten the smoking gun. It might have fallen into our lap. The problem then in September and October of 41 is, yes, there are some clues out there, but how do you put them all together into a cohesive picture? Because the other thing that's happening is that we're getting a lot of, we would call it false returns, but they were actually they were real returns. So let me expand the picture here. This movie is about Pearl Harbor. We focus on Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor, from the Japanese standpoint, is just one small component of their overall plan of campaign, which is aimed to the south. So, as we're looking at the intel, we're like, they could attack us in the Philippines. Maybe they'll attack down in Malaya. Maybe they're going into the Central Pacific. The answer is yes. They're going to attack in all of those places. Okay. So how do you then make sense of that and pull out the little kernels that might also point to the fact that, maybe they've got an interest in Hawaii as well? Those pieces were there. But again, just given the deluge of different data points that are all pointing in different directions, it's real easy ex post facto to come back and say, well, there's this and this and this, and therefore clearly Pearl Harbor was in danger. It was not nearly as obvious at the time.
Yeah, I like what you mentioned, like with the smoking gun. And as you were saying that, I was thinking, referring back to what you're talking about with 9/11, or like, how would you know that that's actually the smoking gun until you knew after the fact what they did to know that that was the smoking gun and not just some deterrent or propaganda or
exactly
some other message that you don't know what it means.
Right. That's right. Yeah. If you actually look at just a map of the opening moves of the Japanese offensive that they're going to start unloading, on December 7th. I mean, there's ships all over the place because they are landing divisions in Malaya to go after the British and, march down towards Singapore. They are doing initial moves out of the Palaus, which are southeast of the Philippines, down into the Central Pacific. And very quickly, they're going to start putting troops into the Philippines as well. There's a lot of transports moving around in the East China Sea. And it's all got to happen by clockwork because the Japanese don't have enough troop transports. And so the transports, they're going to take that initial echelon down to Malaya, are then going to have to move back up north, go to Formosa, pick up more divisions there that are going to be used for the landings against the Philippines. There's just tons and tons of things going on here. It's not all it. The movie makes it seem like, what's going on with Pearl Harbor, where are the Japanese aircraft carriers? But you have to understand that there's just tons of different stuff happening at the same time.
The world's a much bigger picture, so it's not all focused on the United States.
Yeah.
Well, at one point in the movie, we did see Colonel Bratton is kind of piecing together the intercepts because of a message from Tokyo that indicated that they wanted to conclude negotiations no later than November 29th. So he's convinced that the Japanese will attack on Sunday, November 30th. Was there really a belief that that would be the date of the surprise attack?
I don't have a definitive answer to that one. I was actually looking around for that on the basis of those questions. And my sense is that this is another one of those sort of false positives that you've got clue A, B, and C that leads you to, an indication that this could be the day. But this kind of stuff happens all the time, that you'll get something that looks like it's a smoking gun and then nothing happens on that day. And now all of a sudden, all of the decision makers, the admirals are looking at you, Mr. Defense Analyst, and like, well, what the heck, bro? Why did,
How many times has the end of the world been predicted over the, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Speaking of those messages from Japan, there is a plot line during the course of the film that talks about a quote unquote very long message in 14 parts that's sent from Tokyo to the Japanese embassy in DC. And since, like we talked about, the Americans are intercepting everything, they're able to read each part as they come in the movie. But then Tokyo specifically doesn't want to send the final part until the morning of December 7th. So the 14th part of the message instructs their ambassadors to submit their reply to the U.S. government on December 7th at precisely 1 p.m. local time in Washington, D.C. And then there's a follow-up message where they tell their embassy to, quote unquote, destroy at once your cipher machine, all codes, and secret documents. And then in a nutshell, that's kind of seems to be the final confirmation about when the attack will take place. Of course, they still don't know where it's going to take place. But is the movie accurately portraying the storyline of the 14-part message?
Yeah, that's basically all correct. There was a 14-part message. It does not, and we're aware that this message is coming, and we know that, yes, the 14th part needs to be delivered at 1 p.m. Washington time. The message starts getting transmitted, and it doesn't come over sequentially. It's not real clean. It's like parts 5 and 9 were the first ones to be broadcast, so it's just all over the place. And then there's this big gap of a number of hours, and then, so everybody's kind of waiting around for the 14th part to land. And from the Japanese standpoint, this was all kind of bungled. I mean, what the Japanese wanted to do was be able to walk into our Secretary of War's office with, a declaration of war precisely at 1 p.m. And then the attack on Pearl Harbor is going to go down like 5 minutes later. Okay. And they're cutting things really fine because given the sensitivity of this message traffic, the Japanese embassy in Washington was ordered not to use a typist to actually, type out all of the message and put it into this document that's going to be, handed to our guys. So the Japanese end up bungling this, is what it comes down to. And the attack ends up occurring before the message actually gets delivered.
Okay. I think the movie does kind of make a point of having this guy typing there on the typewriter, trying to type things out. Oh, I'm going to take my jacket off a little bit too uncomfortable and then go back to typing, and just taking so long. Everybody else is just watching the clock on the wall to see.
Climbing the walls. Yeah, absolutely. It's funny. I actually, I did a presentation, this was years ago, down in New Orleans at the World War II Museum down there on Pearl Harbor. And it was either the son or the grandson of one of those Japanese guys in the embassy was there to give a talk on that very episode. And he was still just infuriated that basically, the foreign ministry back in Tokyo had set his dad up for failure here because they didn't get this traffic out to him on a timely basis so he could do his job. It was kind of a fustercluck on the part of the Japanese. So,
I guess they didn't have the emails they can just schedule to send one to. A little bit different technology-wise.
Yeah, just, can we just queue this up in MailChimp and have it drop? Oh, come on.
Exactly.
Yeah, that ended happening. So,
yeah. Well, we're about halfway through the timeline of the movie, and I want to ask about it's a brief scene in the movie, but it seems to be significant. On a rather routine patrol, at least seems so in the movie, there's a U.S. Navy ship that notices a submarine's periscope just astern of a Navy tug. It seems to be trying to sneak into the net around Pearl Harbor. So the American ship fires on the submarine. And since the movie is focusing heavily on the planes from the carriers, I should say, that's really one of the only times that we see submarines used by the Japanese in this movie. So can you fill in some more historical context around how they fit into this overall strategy?
So the Japanese want to use 5 little mini subs that they're transporting them out on these mother subs, and they've got a little hatchway that you can get up into the bottom of the submarine. You've got a 2-man crew in each one of these things that are going to be launched. And the idea is that these 5 mini subs are going to sneak into Pearl Harbor at the same time that the aerial attack is going to go down and deliver their own torpedo attacks. They each carry 2 torpedoes against the American ships that are in there. Well, things go awry. Let's just put it that way. And there's still an ongoing controversy as to whether or not one of those submarines did manage to sneak into Pearl Harbor. There's a photo that alleges to show. I don't personally believe it myself for reasons I won't go into. But anyway, this incident that we're depicting here absolutely did happen. So the USS Ward was an old 4-stacker destroyer. And oddly enough, so I live in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and the Ward was manned primarily by naval reservists from Minnesota. And she had a brand new captain. This guy had been in charge of the ship for like less than 24 hours. And just as you say, on the morning of the attack, about an hour and a half before this all goes down, lo and behold, the Ward sights the sub, the sail of a sub and a periscope too. And they end up taking 2 shots at it. And for years, the boys from St. Paul claimed that they had drilled that sub, put a hole right through the sail of that thing, neat as neat. And nobody believed them. And it took, I forget, 55, 60 some years before they finally found that submarine. And there was a hole in the base of the conning tower, and we still have the number 4 gun from the USS Ward sits out at the state capitol about 7 miles that way.
Wow.
Yeah, it's really cool.
Wow.
So, this incident happens. They sink this submarine, they kill its crew, and it sinks. And the Ward then sends a message up, through the channels saying, we have attacked and we believe sunk an enemy submarine off of the mouth of the harbor. And normally you would think that would be sort of an attention getter, but what ends up happening is that we're at a peacetime setting, and the people on the land-based side of things are looking at the captain of the Ward and they're like, this guy is wet behind the ears, man. This dude doesn't know what he's doing. And there are a bunch of naval reservists, and it's like, yeah, okay, whatever, And so they ignore it. And it's not really going to sort of come into the consciousness of the base people until the attack starts going down. And it's like a light bulb.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a thing.
Well, that leads to the kind of like the good letter grade that you gave it for its historical accuracy, because I think there is even a mention of how this guy, he's green, he's Captain Green, he's new. I want confirmation. I need confirmation, and kind of going through that.
Right.
That
how do you
process.
get confirmation of a sub that you've already sunk? So, yeah.
In the movie, not to get too far ahead of the timeline of the movie, but in the movie, as all the planes are going, I think it comes back with, is that enough confirmation for you? Something like that. Yeah.
Exactly. And there's a question here. Okay, 6:30. You've got roughly 80 minutes or so before the attack is going to go down. What could the Americans actually have done with that amount of warning time? It would be very, very difficult to start getting the ships actually out of the harbor in that amount of time. I mean, a lot of cases, these ships are not at actions. None of them are at action stations. A lot of their crews are ashore for shore leave. It's Sunday morning. And just the physical act of firing up the boilers and raising steam takes a long time on a warship of that vintage. And so, I don't know that the ships would have been able to be moved. Had there been coordinated communications between the Army and the Navy, though, among other things, you could have had a better air presence over the island as a result of that. I mean, 90 minutes is plenty of time for me to wake up a bunch of pilots at these airfields and get planes up in the air. So that could have materially changed things.
It sounds like that's another one of those elements that, remembering that the U.S. was not in the war, which I know it's something that everybody knows, but also it's helpful to continuously remember that, because I think there's a big difference between, I think I just watched recently another classic, the Battle of Britain, right? Where you have all these pilots that are just waiting for the call to go up. And so they go up in just a matter of minutes. And this is a little bit different for the guys who, there's no war going on. It's technically peace. So it's a little bit different. They're not going to, they could get up faster, but still it's not wartime. And I think it's always good to remember that.
And among other things, this is one of those sort of boring, behind the scenes things that nobody thinks about. There was no joint Army-Navy operations room for the defense of this island at this time. So there's no easy way for a Navy skipper to send a report up to, his superiors and then have that information be promulgated across to the Army, who is in charge of the air defense of this island, to say, scramble your damn fighters. There could be something coming in here. Something's up, At least be on higher alert, because we just sank a submarine out in front of the entrance of the most important naval base in the Pacific.
Speaking of things that they hadn't figured out at this point in the war yet, there is a new piece of technology that the Americans get, according to the movie, to help detect intruders on the sea and in the air. And this new technology is called radar. On the morning of December 7th, we see two guys manning the radar station at Opana Point, and they detect two large pulses coming in. So they call it in. Lieutenant Tyler answers, and he says, don't worry about it. They're just the B-17s coming in from the mainland. And then a little later in the movie, we actually see the B-17s arriving, so they're a real thing, but they're also getting attacked by the Japanese planes. I love the quote from one of the pilots. It's like, what a way to fly into a war, unarmed and out of gas. Can you take us through what actually happened with the radar and the B-17s?
That's all 100% legit. All of that happened. Yeah. So yes, there's a brand new experimental radar station up at Opana Point. You can still drive by it today. And yeah, there were these two cats up there who were calibrating the radar set, and one of them was brand new. And so, the more senior guy was kind of breaking this junior dude in, and, here's how you operate this particular radar set. And so, yeah, they see this. Understand too that at this time, that era of radar didn't have the sort of the classic radar scope that we look at, where we've got this, rotating thingy and it's plotting the azimuth and all. No, basically these guys are looking at an oscilloscope, and what they're seeing is that at this bearing, which is almost due north, we got this big old spike. Something's coming in from the north, and so yes, these two cats telephoned down to Lieutenant Kermit Tyler. And I met Kermit Tyler right before he died. I was out at a symposium in Hawaii, and that poor guy. I mean, he had to live with that particular set of events for the rest of his life, because he knows that there's some B-17s coming in, and he knows that they often approach kind of from the north to do their landing exercises, and we got a big spike. It's in that general neck of the woods. Yeah, that's what he says. Don't worry about it. And the other thing again is that even if Kermit Tyler had raised holy hell, once again, the fact that we do not have joint communications with Army and Navy, he didn't have the ability to, pick up the phone and call Admiral Kimmel, for instance, and say, there's airplanes coming in. There was none of that sort of, what do I want to say, operational communications infrastructure in place. Kermit really had kind of his hands tied behind his back in terms of what he could do. But yeah, he becomes one of these sort of scapegoats that everybody knows about this incident, And yeah, it absolutely did happen, and Kermit had to live with it for the rest of his life.
It sounds almost like the scapegoat in the movie, at least the version of the Japanese typist trying to type things out really slowly and all that kind of makes that out, and it almost sounds like it's another version of that. What can you do? I mean, even if you did get that notification, what would you do with it?
What would you do with it? Right, and this is later than that sinking of the submarine, where the planes are getting close at this point, and just given the speed of advance of that air power that's coming in, they're going the better part of 200 miles an hour. Your time to take actionable information and turn that into results on those airfields in terms of getting more fighter cover overhead is distinctly limited. And that window closes very quickly, and now it's game on.
the movie doesn't mention this, but I would imagine, especially too, because they changed the formations of the planes on the airfield, that would take a little bit longer for them to get up. I'm
Probably
guessing
true.
just to a little bit different than what they would normally be, and so that would just add another. They would have to
Layer
know
of
even
complexity.
earlier to make any sort of difference.
Right.
On that.
Right. The other thing is too that the Japanese were taking very serious measures to make sure that they were going to really stomp on air power in the Hawaiian Islands. Again, in the course of the movie, we of course tend to fixate on what happens in the anchorage in Pearl Harbor itself. But if you look at a breakdown of the individual sorties that the Japanese, okay, I got this package of 180 planes coming in the first wave. I got another 167 behind them in the second wave. If you look at what those 180 planes are supposed to be doing in that first wave, half of them are airfield suppression. Because the Japanese are terribly concerned that there are a lot of aircraft on Oahu, and we don't want those airplanes coming up in the air, messing with our attack force, or even worse, reaching out and touching our aircraft carriers. No, 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 no. So a lot of those planes are devoted to shutting down every airfield on Oahu. Again, from the American standpoint, a Japanese raid would be one or two carriers, right? And they would be probably focused on the anchorage exclusively. The Japanese, this is an entirely different animal. We're bringing 350 planes, and we're not just going to attack the anchorage. We're gonna shut this whole island down in terms of all the aircraft too. It's an immensely sophisticated plan. No other navy in the world could do this at this point in time. The Japanese carrier force, Kido Butai, is as revolutionary in its way as the German Panzer Division was at about the same time in terms of ground warfare. Nobody else has this capability at this point. We couldn't do this kind of attack until early 1944.
Wow.
Yeah. This is a distinctly capable beastie that the Japanese have unleashed on us. We just don't understand what it can do. Anyway, I'm digressing here, but the point of the matter is that even if we had gotten a few more fighters up in the air, it doesn't really matter, I don't think, in terms of the overall impact, because they're bringing dozens and dozens of Zero fighters down that are expressly tasked with just sweeping the skies clean of any fighters that they run into. The Zero is a better machine than most of the fighters that we have on the island. And at this time in the war, we don't understand the capabilities of the Zero as an airframe, and so we would be fighting it using the incorrect kind of tactics. At this point in time, our fighter pilots are taught you want to get into a dogfight. That's how you shoot down an enemy plane. Here to tell you, you try flying a P-40 or even worse, an older P-36, which was a lot of the machines on this island. You try dogfighting that against a Zero, you are dead. You get shot down, like boom, they take you right out, because the Zero climbs faster, turns tighter. And they got really, really good pilots. So the net result is to say that even if Kermit had done his thing, even if we had given the, call out the hounds, and we managed to get a few dozen more fighters up in the air, I don't know that it necessarily has that big an impact on the outcome of the attack.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I like that you mentioned the Zeros and not fighting against them. That made me ask, not associated with the movie at all, but was it, who was the general, the Flying Tigers that were fighting over in China? Yeah. Did that help them at all to know, like, strategy of fighting against Zeros, or in that strategy that maybe not all the pilots on Pearl would happen to know that, but did that help at all?
If they had listened to Chenault, yes, it would have. Yes, because you're absolutely right. We had this unit in China that had been tangling with the Zero for a little while, and yeah, we knew the characteristics of this plane, but Chenault really, he's technically working for the U.S. Army Air Corps, but he's also kind of this rogue operator who's out in China, and nobody believes the intel that's coming out of there. It's going to take a good 6 months or so of actually tangling with this airplane, and in the course of those early war campaigns, the Zero gains this reputation as really being sort of a super fighter. It's not. But if you use the wrong tactics against it, the results are distinctly unpleasant. And so it really would not be until the Battle of Midway, a guy named Jimmy Thatch came up with a new tactic. He's like, okay, well, we can't outturn these suckers, but I've got this method of interweaving, my airplanes so that any approach that the enemy fighter takes, they're going to face the potential of a head-on attack against one of my elements of fighters that is, maneuvering back and forth. Anyway, we eventually get a handle on how to fight the Zero, but it takes a number of months and honestly, a lot of dead fighter pilots along the way to realize that this is an extremely capable, nimble, dangerous airplane. Don't dogfight it or you will die.
If we go back to the movie, we're about an hour and 47 minutes into the movie is when we hear the title of the movie.
Right.
It is a long movie. It is a long movie. Almost 2 hours into it is when we hear the title, Tora, Tora, Tora. And those are the code words, according to the movie, those are the code words to be sent by the Japanese pilots if they've achieved the element of surprise. And we see it happening in the movie. As the planes are flying over the island, there's no anti-aircraft guns firing, no American fighters over the harbor. It seems to be a complete surprise. So the code words are sent. And then soon after that, we see the first shots being fired by the Japanese fighters. There's 3 planes strafing a submarine in the harbor. That's the first shot that we see in the movie. Moments later, there's a band playing the Star Spangled Banner as the flag is being raised on one of the decks of the ship. And then the Japanese start swarming and they just rush through the song. They don't just stop. They just rush through the song to finish it as they start to realize what's happening. How well did the movie do showing the moment of the surprise attack at Pearl Harbor itself?
I give him a B+ on that. Okay, so the actual first attack on Oahu doesn't happen at Pearl Harbor. It happens further north on the island at Wheeler Airfield.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and again, because they want to suppress, they being the Japanese, want to suppress the American air power on this island, Wheeler, which is north, gets plastered by dive bombers and strafing fighters. And so that goes down about 10 minutes before the actual attack on the anchorage itself. I think the first bomb that lands actually does land on Ford Island in the middle of the anchorage. And then, there's a lot of sort of hurry up kind of stuff going on because you're right. That's legit. There were flags being raised, it's the beginning of the morning. It's 0800, let's get our day on. And all of a sudden, you got these planes buzzing around the harbor. I'll tell you what, when you stand today on the deck of the USS Missouri, which is moored there in the harbor, basically at the point where the USS Oklahoma, which is one of the battleships that was sunk during the attack, you stand on the deck of the Missouri and you can look out over the water and particularly up the length of the Southeast Lock, which goes up towards the submarine base. And that body of water, because it basically aimed right at Battleship Row, was the point of attack for a lot of the Japanese torpedo planes. They went right down the Southeast Lock as they're heading towards Battleship Row, and then they sort of peeled off to hit Oklahoma, West Virginia, what have you. It is still, to this day, it just brings shivers up my spine, standing over that, looking over that body of water and imagining what it must have been like to be an American sailor on one of those ships and watching these planes coming in on you and dropping their torpedoes one at a time. There's not a damn thing you can do about it. I mean, you're just utterly helpless. The guns are not manned. In many cases, the ready ammunition for the guns is locked up in lockers and you can't find the keys. I mean, it was a hot mess. And again, just the feeling of powerlessness, watching these puppies lining up on you and dropping these torpedoes, and, in they come like these accusing fingers, towards the side of your ship. Oh man, this is not going to be a good day.
It's understandable. Like, you're not going to know exactly what happened in the moments. It's not like there was footage, security camera footage that we have of that attack moment. But I did like the way that the movie portrays different reactions by different people. Like, one of the officers is just like, I'll get that guy's number, or, I'm going to get him in trouble, right, for flying. And then a bomb drops and he's like, wait a minute, what? And then you even have the officers a ways from the harbor itself, and you can see things going off in the distance, right? And everybody's just starting to recognize what's going on, and it's that moment that, yeah,
Absolutely.
I can imagine what it would be like.
Yeah, unimaginable.
Yeah.
How must they have been feeling trying to change their entire perceptual apparatus to,
Yeah.
oh my God, because obviously there were a lot of guys in the Navy at this point who felt that there's going to be a war, but not a lot of them thought that we're going to be the first casualties in that war. That was not a thought that had occurred to many of these people in peacetime Oahu at all. It's going to be this poor clowns out in the Philippines. We know they're going to get invaded. It's going to be them. And it's like, no, baby.
We talked earlier about the airfields and the moving the planes to avoid the sabotage. But then as we see the attack happening in the movie, you can see that the planes are trying, there's some that are trying to get off the ground. They're obviously outnumbered. There's some that are blowing up before they can get off. But then there's 2 American pilots that managed to get off the ground. We see, I think I counted that they shot down 3 Japanese planes that we saw in the movie, but we don't really see a lot about what happened to them. Can you fill in kind of the rest of the story around the American pilots who did manage to get off the ground during the attack?
And this is where you don't get your good value for your money, because I'm like a big picture, operations level dude, and I don't know the individual particulars. I can't remember the names of the 2 guys. How's that for lame? But yeah, the bottom line is that there was a little almost like a divert field. It wasn't even a main airfield at all. It was like this little dirt airstrip up north on the coast. And these 2 guys, they pile into their Jeep and they go racing up there. I don't think it was a Jeep, actually. It was like a civilian Studebaker or something, because there's a couple of P-40s sitting up at that strip that they know of. And they're like, yeah, let's go. And so, they hop up there, they get in their planes, they get up, and yes, they do shoot down 2 or 3 of those aircraft. So yay team. I mean, those guys showed commendable initiative, and they did what they could do. And I would just like to stop it there and say that, of course, in one of the movies, in the recent Pearl Harbor movie, of course, 2 of those cats then end up supposedly being pilots on the Doolittle mission.
Of course.
Which is
the Americans had more than 2 pilots? What?
I'm here to tell you that no fighter jock is going to be like, yeah, put me in a multi-engine medium bomber that, handles like a dump truck. Yeah, that is so the duty that I want. Yeah, it's just absolute nonsense.
Well, it was Ben Affleck. He ends up coming Batman anyway. So, he's used to flying all that kind of thing.
True. Good point. Yeah. So there you go. Yeah, but that incident did happen. They did shoot down a couple, 3, the Japanese planes, and then kind of, ran out of targets. And I think one of them was forced down. I can't remember the particulars.
Well, this is maybe you've already answered this, kind of a hypothetical situation. But as I was watching the movie, I couldn't help but think about what might have been different if maybe they hadn't grouped all their planes together so that they had gotten easily destroyed. Maybe they could have more. Do you think that would have changed anything, or kind of what we were talking about earlier? They didn't know much about the Zeros and attacks, and it really wouldn't have made much difference anyway.
Yeah, I mean, certainly it would have complicated things for the Japanese. But I think in the grand scheme of things, I forget the exact number of Zeros that they're bringing down in the first wave, but it's the better part of 50 or 60 Zeros, and they're going to wipe out whatever aircraft we put up is my guess. But we should not poo-poo the value of time in this case, because even in the first wave attack, where the Japanese basically had their way with us because we were completely surprised in the anchorage, at least. If you really get down in the weeds and grind the numbers on the casualties amongst the Japanese torpedo plane attackers, for instance, it's clear that even within the space of 2, 3, 4 minutes, that American anti-aircraft fire was increasing dramatically. And there was a destroyer moored in the Southeast Lock, a ship called the Bagley. And it had, basically these torpedo planes that were running down the Southeast Lock, lining up the runs against Battleship Rower, just parading past the Bagley. And by the end of that series of runs, the Bagley bags several of those planes. And so you can sort of see the casualties for the Japanese were already starting to go up by the tail end of the first wave attack. And so if you posit that, okay, somebody listens to Kermit Tyler, there's a big bunch of unknown planes coming down on this island. Even if we had so much as had 10 extra minutes to just get the ready usage ammunition for the anti-aircraft guns ready to go, and those ships were buttoned up, they couldn't move, but if they're at least in better watertight integrity and they have more of the ready ammo, that could have significantly increased Japanese casualties. As it is, the first wave comes in, they do their thing, they destroy the Arizona, they sink the Oklahoma, the capsizer, and the first wave is just a nightmare for us. There's this second wave that comes in that's composed mostly of dive bombers, and if you look at the photography, the historical photography that is taken from some of these Japanese planes in the second wave as they're coming in, holy Moses, there's a lot of anti-aircraft fire. They were very disagreeably surprised with how incredibly dense American ACAC was. So again, in a counterfactual vein, even 10 or 15 extra minutes might not have done that much in terms of the damage that was inflicted against those vessels, but it could have done a lot in terms of the amount of damage we could do against the Japanese attacking force.
Makes sense. Yeah, and that goes back to, it's a what if. We don't, looking at it after the fact, we don't really know.
Yeah.
But if we shift back to the movie, while the attack is happening there at Pearl Harbor, the movie then goes to Washington, D.C., and we see the Japanese ambassador Nomura arriving at Cordell Hull's office to deliver their message as ordered by the 14th part. We kind of talked about that a little bit earlier. But even though they were told to deliver it at 1 p.m., the movie shows it's a slow typist. There's a reason why they're being late. We already talked about that. But when they get there, Mr. Hull is on the phone with the president, wants to confirm that the attack has happened before he receives the Japanese ambassador. When he does, the ambassador hands him the paper and, he reads it. And this is the dialogue that Hull has in the movie. From that response, he says, "I have never seen a document so crowded with infamous falsehoods and distortions on a scale so huge that I never imagined until today that any government on this planet was capable of uttering them." And then no more words said. Nomura just gets up, leaves the room with tail between his legs. I mean, obviously very hushed, quiet, somber moment. Do you think the movie was successful in capturing the essence of the true story here?
Word for word. It's perfect.
Wow.
It's perfect. And the subtext there that we don't get is Nomura and Hull are friends. They'd known each other for a long time. And Nomura, there's some pathos there. Nomura was not aware that this attack was coming. He was legitimately sent to DC as a special envoy, and he was working earnestly and honestly to try to come to a diplomatic agreement, between his two countries. And so he really, he's one of these guys that just really got set up, because the militarists, of course, had made the decision long before that they wanted a war. And so, here's Nomura really doing his best to bring about a settlement. And he's now the fall guy and has to give this document to Hull, who he knows. And so, he was personally crushed by the attack and the results of this war, between these two countries, because he's been in the U.S. a lot. He knows us.
Wow, that adds even more context to, in the movie, when he receives that final message, he looks at the clock on the wall, and I think it says something like 11 o'clock in the morning or somewhere around there. And he's expected to deliver this at 1 p.m. in just a couple hours. So it seems like that's just when he's finding out what actually is happening. It's just kind of unraveling. Like, what?
Are you kidding me? Really?
Wow.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Again, that's one of those things I can't wrap my head around. Like, you being in that moment, realizing what's happening, and it's already happened, really, and you have to be the one to break this news. It's already happened.
That's right. Yeah, the machine is operating here, and it is completely out of your control. And now you're left to pick up the pieces and be the delivery boy for this thing that you did not want. I mean, understand, there are plenty of people in the Japanese government who thought that a war against the U.S. was going to be a disaster, and have been working as assiduously as they could. There's a really interesting book written by a Japanese woman called 1941 Road to Infamy, and she talks about just how feckless the Japanese senior leadership was, and there were plenty of people in their leadership who understood that a war with us is not going to end well, but no one was willing to fall on their sword and actually stand up in some of these liaison meetings where they're actually, lurching towards war through the fall and say, time out, guys, this is nuts. We can't do this. Everyone else is looking at everyone else and say, I hope that guy falls on his sword. And the result is that the can just keeps getting kicked down down the road. And now the carriers have sailed, and Nomura, is one of these cats, and he gets to pick up the pieces, and the ship has sailed. We're at war now. Oh my God.
Not only being at war, but also the manner in which it happens. Like if him finding out that it's already happened. I don't know. The movie doesn't really seem to imply if Nomura knew that ahead of time or not, or if it was just Hull that knew that the attack had happened. But you're going to find out. I mean, that's just, it's just your honor, your everything is just broken.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Well, if we go back to the attack at Pearl Harbor in the movie, it shows the Japanese planes returning to their characters, and it focuses on one of the pilots, Lieutenant Commander Fuchida, who is shocked to find out that they're not ordering another wave of attacks to destroy the American carriers and their dry docks.
Yep.
Instead, the signal is for all the ships to head back to Japan as soon as the rest of the planes return.
That's right.
And the explanation in the movie is that they've achieved the mission that they were tasked with. Their task force is vital to the war effort that they've just started, and the war is just beginning.
Yep.
Now, as I understand it, this is the part of the movie that drives what we now know as the fuel tank myth.
Correct.
It's the idea that if the Japanese had launched another wave of attacks, they would have launched that wave of attacks against the repair facilities and fuel tanks around Pearl Harbor.
Right.
And that would have essentially been the nail in the coffin, so to speak, for the American war effort.
Yep.
Can you unravel this true story behind the fuel tank myth that's implied in the movie here?
Oh, yeah. There's so much to unpack.
Where do you even
here.
start?
Oh, yeah. Where do we go? Fuchida is a very important guy. Fuchida was the attack leader for the mission. He was the air group commander on the Akagi. He was a very charismatic, intelligent man who wrote a number of books after the war. He survives the war. He converts to Christianity, becomes a Christian missionary. And he's a technical advisor also on Tora. And he also spins some of the most pernicious myths and lies about this war that pertain to the Battle of Midway. They pertain to some of the early war operations out in places like India, the Indian Ocean, and they really pertain here at Pearl Harbor. That whole sequence of events. So we see Fuchida land on the Akagi, and just as you say, he gets out of his cockpit, he talks to his crew chief, and is like, why aren't the preparations for a third attack wave happening here? And the crew chief says, well, we haven't gotten any orders. Fuchida looks up to the bridge, and he sees his buddy, Minoru Genda. Genda is the air officer for 1st Air Fleet. He's the real, the visionary, the air power guy. He's Admiral Nagumo's right-hand man when it comes to air planning. And so Fuchida and Genda share this sort of profound look, and Genda then turns around and has this argument with Admiral Nagumo on the bridge that, we can't stop now. We've got to go back and find the American carriers, attack their fuel depots and repair basins. And Nagumo says somewhat rudely, you can hear this in Japanese, "Chigao," which means it's different or you're wrong. It's really rude to actually say that in Japanese. It's kind of like shut up, And Nagumo says, no, the war is just beginning. We have achieved the directives that we've been asked to achieve, which was to sink 4 American battleships. That's not in the movie, but that we know that now. And so, we have to preserve this force, and we're turning around and we're going home. That argument never happened. Never happened. It's all a concoction of Fuchida. And Genda tells this in his own autobiography that was published after the war as well, where he becomes aware when Tora comes out, now there's this sort of kerfuffle that happens, in the States and also in Japan, that, wow, there should have been a third attack wave, None of that happened because the Japanese, Nagumo never wanted to do a third attack against the harbor. And even if he had, he never would have targeted repair depots and fuel tanks and stuff like that. And here's why. If you look at the actual target priorities that are handed down from Combined Fleet, i.e. Yamamoto, to Nagumo, this is what your target list is, buddy. At the top of the list is land-based air power, right? Again, they're very concerned about our aircraft. And then it's aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and other combatants, merchant ships, and only item number 6 do you get into harbor facilities. And we as Americans, we look at that, we're like, well, my God, why wouldn't you go after logistics? And it's like, well, because Japanese naval doctrine didn't really think that logistics was all that important. They're focused on short-term gains because they know this war has got to be short in duration. If they can't win this thing in a year or less, they're doomed, right? And the coin of the realm at this point in time, in terms of naval power, is the battleship. So really what they're trying to do is they're trying to attack American morale. We're trying to, and we're going to sink a bunch of your battleships. And we don't have that many, right? There's only 15 or 16 in the total U.S. inventory at this point in time. And so if you sink 4 or 5 of those, man, that's tantamount to a national calamity there. So the goal is that they're going to bloody our Navy and make us basically say, you know what, the heck with this. We're going to go fight Germany and we'll let the Japanese have their ill-gotten gains in the Pacific. So it's a total morale play. In that context, in that mental context, are we really going to throw in the towel because they blew up a bunch of our fuel tanks in Pearl Harbor? Oh, nobody the American population, we're the biggest oil exporter in the world at this point. Texas floats on crude oil. Oh, they blew up some fuel tanks. That is absolutely immaterial. And for the Japanese as well, their Navy is oriented strictly around what are we doing in terms of destroying enemy warships. If you're not sinking any more warships, you're doing something wrong. So logistics is just very much an afterthought. So it's interesting. If you look at Fuchida's accounts, they interviewed him right after the war in October of 1945, and they asked him point blank in those interviews as part of the strategic bombing survey. They said, why didn't you guys go back and hit us again? Why didn't you go after the fuel tanks? And his answer in October 1945 is, well, we knew we had sunk at least 4 of your battleships, which, checked the box in terms of what we were tasked to do. We didn't know where your carriers were. That really was kind of worrisome. And, at the end of the day, we thought we had fulfilled our mission, so we went home. Fast forward to 1963, when he's giving interviews to Gordon Prang, who's the guy who wrote At Dawn We Slept, and who was also a technical advisor for Tora. Fuchida in 63 tells Gordon Prang, when I was flying back from Pearl Harbor, I was mentally cataloging all of the shore facilities and, fuel tanks and logistics stuff. So what Fuchida wants you to believe is that I had this mental epiphany in the air where, we barely worked our way into item number 3 on the target list. But I know that if I just jump down to the bottom to item number 6, that's going to win the war for us, right? That's the line he's basically trying to sell us in this movie. It's baloney. It's all baloney. And I think what really happened is that interview in October of 1945 put the clue into Fuchida's head. They really thought the fuel tanks were kind of important. I wonder why that was. He's a smart guy, a charismatic guy, and lo and behold, by 1963, 18 years later, his narrative has turned around into a story that hands us Americans this, the thing that we would expect to hear, and also makes Fuchida out to be more intelligent and prescient than he actually was. So But the bottom line is, because everybody is seeing Tora, this whole fuel tank thing and third attack wave is cemented in the collective American consciousness around this war. And to this day, even though I've put umpty articles out on it and other people have too, this whole notion of the fuel tank attack is still out there because, of course, how many millions of people have seen Tora, as opposed to the 10,000 folks who's, read some nerd named Jon Parshall's article on the fuel tank myth, right? It's an unequal contest, but that's where we're at.
Well, we're trying to balance that out a little bit. Maybe get a few more people to read your article.
That's right.
It's fascinating that you mentioned that, though, about the Imperial Japanese Navy's perspective on logistics, because you were just talking about earlier, too, where the Americans didn't think that the Japanese would be able to take this huge fleet and fuel them to get to where they did, and the Japanese figured out how to do that. And so it would make sense then that, okay, if we figured out how to do that, it's only a matter of time before the Americans can too. So that's probably why it's not as important. Like, the ships are more important. Just even from that perspective, I'm not a military strategist by any means, but that makes sense to me.
Yeah. So again, it's difficult to put ourselves back in the heads of participants, at 80 plus years removed, but that you're exactly right. And there's some arrogance on our part too. We also were very good at underway refueling. We were the pioneers in that respect. And so we knew we could do it. And we also knew that we were better at it than the British. And so, from our perspective, well, if the Brits can't do it, there's no way in hell the Japanese are able to do that kind of thing. So again, we've got these kind of societal blinders on in terms of what their carrier force could actually do. And man, this is a real eye-opener for us here on December 7th.
Well, there's another major thing that comes out of this movie, Tora, that I want to ask you about. At the very end of the movie, the line of dialogue, and you already know what it is, but I'll set it up for the listeners. It's delivered by Admiral Yamamoto in the movie after he finds out about the whole blunder with the diplomats who failed to deliver their message on time. Here is the direct quote from Yamamoto in the movie. Quote, "I had intended to deal a fatal blow to the American fleet by attacking Pearl Harbor immediately after Japan's official declaration of war. But according to the American radio, Pearl Harbor was attacked 55 minutes before our ultimatum was delivered in Washington. I can't imagine anything that would infuriate the Americans more. I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." End quote. And that is how the movie ends. That last line is what that's really what people have done, but the beginning part sets up some of that context from the movie. So as we wrap up our discussion today, perhaps I've saved the biggest question for the end. How accurate is that sleeping giant quote from Yamamoto that we see in the movie?
Man, screenwriters really get, they earn their money. Because that line is one of the most famous lines, I think, in almost any war movie. And there is absolutely zero written evidence that Yamamoto ever said it. So, yeah.
Wow.
There you go.
It just knocked it down from that A++++++ all the way down to the name.
Yeah, good point. Actually, good point. Because there's been a lot of speculation about that particular quote, and some of the nerds and I, there aren't that many biographies of Admiral Yamamoto. There's only one that's sort of the standard work that gets quoted in English. And if you troll through Agawa's biography of Yamamoto, you will not find that quote in there. He does say to several different people, there's another sort of similar quote where he's like, if I'm told to go to war against the Americans, I will run wild for the first 6 months to a year, but after that, I have no confidence of victory. That is a legitimate quote. But yeah.
I think the movie mentioned something like that briefly when, I don't remember, maybe it was Yamamoto, but it was early in the movie, he was talking to the Emperor, like, how long can we survive a war? And he's like, maybe a year after that, who knows, right? That kind of
Which
thing.
Which again, gets into this point that the Japanese go into this conflict understanding they've got to get it over with rapidly. They've got to get us to the negotiating table as soon as possible, which is why they're trying to not only Pearl Harbor. There are two intended effects as far as the Japanese are concerned. from a purely military standpoint, what they want to do is they want to knock the American battle fleet out of action so that it is not in a position to counterattack across the Central Pacific and go into the flank of all of their advances, which were heading south to grab the oil, right? That's the first thing you got to do is cover your flank. But more important is we've got to crush American morale so that they become so demoralized that they will be willing to come to the bargaining table. And from that standpoint, the way that they opened the war with what the American public perceived as being a dastardly sneak attack, that quote is right on the money. I mean, we were infuriated. And, you can say at that point, the negotiated settlement gambit is dead on arrival at this point, because Roosevelt says in his address the following day to Congress, when he's asking for a declaration of war, that the American people are going to win through to complete and utter victory. He's almost spelling out the whole unconditional surrender thing that's going to be absolutely clearly articulated starting in 1943 after the Casablanca Conference. But from their very get-go, he's basically saying to the Japanese, we're not negotiating with you guys.
Yeah. We tried that. Not happen again.
This is what's going to happen. We are going to dictate the terms of the end of this war. We and only we. And so, buckle up because here we go. The other thing I would like to say before we wrap this up is that, Pearl Harbor continues to be the source of conspiracy theories, that Roosevelt knew. Roosevelt, deliberately got us into this war. And this is another aspect of this battle that just won't die. And again, there are clear analogs here between Pearl Harbor and 9/11 in that I think we as Americans, being a very large, powerful country, just have difficulty wrapping our heads around when an undervalued, poorer enemy somehow gets the drop on us, And the truth of the matter is, of course, that nasty surprises are the currency of war. I mean, that always happens. And sometimes even the poorer opponent outthinks you, and we hate to admit that, right? So you look at 9/11, it had to be an inside job, and Pearl Harbor, you get the same thing. Just from a simplicity standpoint, if you posit that FDR did want to get the U.S. into a war against Japan, there were a lot easier ways of going about doing it than getting half of your battle fleet sunk and killing 2,500 guys at Pearl Harbor, right? We knew that there were Japanese troop convoys at sea in, the China Sea that was basically the waterway that runs between China and the Philippines. All you had to do was send one or two American destroyers out into those waterways from Manila and snoop around some of those Japanese troop convoys. I guarantee you the Japanese would have sunk those ships, and you've now got your casus belli, okay? And you've killed 200 American boys as opposed to 2,500 and gotten rid of 5 battleships, 2 of them permanently. So I just think that the notion that FDR knew this was coming, again, just given the hodgepodge of intelligence that we had, that's nonsense. And furthermore, even if he had nefarious goals, there were much easier ways of accomplishing those nefarious goals than getting stomped on at Pearl Harbor.
Well, before we do wrap up, there's one thing I want to ask, because we're talking about Tora today. It came out in 1970. We talked briefly about the other movie, Pearl Harbor from 2001, 31 years after this one.
Yep.
That was still 23 years ago, as we're recording this in 2024. So I have a 2-part question for you. Do you think it's time for another Pearl Harbor movie? And if so, let's just say that they're going to hire you as the historical consultant.
Yeah.
How would you approach it differently?
Yeah. Well, obviously the fuel tank myth is going to go. That's out of here. Got to invest a lot more in CGI, right? I mean, really what I'd want to do is just have a better depiction of the attack sequences and a little bit more of the nuance around some of the some of the traditional scapegoats like Kermit Tyler, but again, even within the context of Tora, which is a damn long movie, there's always this difficulty in how do you convey nuance to an audience who only can really tolerate the introduction of so many characters and so many plot twists in the course of a 2-hour spiel. It's pretty tough to do.
It needs to be a series, is what you're saying.
Yeah, kinda. Turn it into a mini series. That probably would go much better.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show to separate fact from fiction in the movie Tora. I guess I lied in the last question. Before I let you go, I actually have 2 more questions for you. The first is for listeners who have only seen the movie and want to learn more about the true story, where would you recommend they start? And then secondly, can you give us a peek into what you're working on now?
There's a mountain of books on Pearl Harbor. And so I would say, Walter Lord's Day of Infamy remains very good from a narrative standpoint. I don't have a copy of that up here. Gordon Prang's At Dawn We Slept still remains sort of a standard. It's pretty hefty, but if you want to get into it, that's a good one. If you're just going out to Hawaii and you're going to tour Pearl Harbor and you want a quick, much thinner little trimmer, I would say Mark Still's Tora. He's using a lot of the latest research on the battle. He's a really solid author. I recommend him highly. If you're interested in sort of the Japanese side of the battle, H.P. Wilmot's Pearl Harbor, this is kind of harder to find, but he is working with a Japanese co-author, a very fine naval historian, a guy named Haruo Tomatsu, who's really, really good. So this is a good one too. But in terms of the definitive multi-volume series that is still in the process of being published now, there's this group effort by my friend Mike Wenger and some of his co-authors who are using incredible photography from the battle. Mike does such good work in that regard, and he's also really good with the Japanese sources. So this multi-volume series that is coming out from Naval Institute Press, we're still waiting for the volume that's going to actually talk about the attack on the anchorage itself. But when it comes out, I think it's going to be really wonderful, really definitive, because it really does dig into the Japanese sources. So yeah, Wenger, Bob Cressman, and John DiVigilio, and also Sam Tagaya is their 4th co-author that they just roped into this project. These are tremendous books. In terms of what I'm doing, I have been working for the last 16 years on a new history of the year 1942, basically talking about the entire war, Pacific, Eastern Front, Mediterranean, Battle of the Atlantic, the whole schmear, looking at how the Allies turned around their train wrecks during that year, because the year starts out, it's just a dumpster fire, Pearl Harbor, calamity all across the Pacific, bad things happening in the Eastern Front. It's terrible. And yet by the end of the year, with the Battle of El Alamein, the landings in North Africa and Torch, our successes in Guadalcanal, and of course, the counterattack around Stalingrad, that war has been turned onto an entirely new path. How did that happen? There's a lot of stuff going on under the hood. So, I will be publishing that book in the first quarter of 2026. And if you want to learn more about it, you can visit the website at www.1942book.com. And sign up for the mailing list. I promise not to spam you, but give you occasional updates on how the book is progressing. But I'm looking forward to getting it out.
Fantastic. I'll make sure to add a link to that in the show notes. Thank you again so much for your time, Jon.
Appreciate it. Yeah, great to be here.
This episode of Based on a True Story was produced by me, Dan Lefebvre. I'd like to thank Jon Parshall once again for helping us separate fact from fiction in Tora. If you want to learn more about the true story, Jon mentioned some great resources for you at the end there, and I've got links to those in the show notes for you to check out. While you're there, make sure to look for Jon's new book that he's working on right now about what happened in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor in 1942 over at 1942book.com. You'll find a link to that in the show notes as well. And as always, you'll find all those links on the show's home on the web, basedonatruestorypodcast.com/355. Okay, now it's time for the answer to our 2 truths and a lie game from the beginning of the episode. And as a quick refresher, here are the 2 truths and 1 lie. Number 1, the Japanese wanted to launch a 3rd wave of planes, but couldn't after they lost the element of surprise. Number 2, Ambassador Nomura didn't know the attack was coming. Number 3, there is no evidence that Yamamoto actually said the famous sleeping giant quote. Did you catch which one is a lie? Got the answer right here, locked away in the envelope. And let's find out. The lie is number 1. The Japanese wanted to launch a third wave of planes, but couldn't after they lost the element of surprise. That is the basis of the fuel tank myth that John talked about at the end, the idea of a third attack wave attacking the fuel tanks and repair depots. John unpacked how the fuel tank myth came about, as well as why it's a myth, and the idea of a third wave of attacks both wasn't in the plan, and even if it had been, they wouldn't have attacked repair depots and fuel tanks. And with that, we've come to an end of this episode. Thank you so much for listening or watching if you're checking out the video version of this. Here in a minute on the video version, the credits will roll at the end, so I'd encourage you to stick around for those so you can learn maybe about how you can get your own name in the credits for the next episode. Or if you're listening to the audio version of this, look in the show notes for a link to learn where you can do that over at basedonatruestorypodcast.com/producers. Until next time, thanks so much for spending your time with John and I today, and I'll chat with you again really soon.